Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Anderson, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking to Sree. Sree is the Global Director of Sustainability at Kearney, one of the world's leading management consultancies. That means her job is basically to consult the sustainability leads of some of the world's largest companies. So she has an incredible perspective on what these companies are focusing on and why. She's also based in the US, and a lot of those clients are US headquartered. So we can't help ourselves from discussing the US election, given that it was just a few days away at the time of the recording. Obviously, you have two different candidates, one with a more climate-friendly disposition than another, to say it lightly. So we get into that and what it might mean for the regulatory environment and these kind of things. I'm in general extremely interested in the regulatory environment when we talk about sustainability because we've seen it enact so much change in the EU. So we discussed this a little bit, how the US compares to the EU, but also how American companies are affected by overseas legislation. Finally, Sree's background is as a human rights lawyer. So she's done a lot of on-the-ground work with human rights specifically. We'll dive into traceability quite a bit with some very specific examples around the coffee industry. And we'll dive into various dilemmas when you're working with transformation and change at the very source of the supply chain. Okay, Sree, Global Director of Sustainability at Kearney. Here we go. Hello, it's so good to see you.
So good to see you.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Very good as well, thank you. We have a costume party tomorrow at the office, and I have no idea what to wear. So beyond that stress, I'm fine.
What about your son?
He's very good.
His costume.
He has so he's very into Sonic for some reason. So he has like a Sonic full body suit that he's going to be wearing to daycare tomorrow.
That's fun.
Yeah,
it's
that's
to
very
see
nice.
that it's like widespread, that this whole culture of dressing up and having something fun for the kids is all over.
Yeah, absolutely. Halloween wasn't a thing in Denmark 5 years ago, but it's really we're very Americanized in Denmark. So it's like we like to just piggyback on the traditions and start commercializing it.
I love it. So I just moved to Atlanta, and I'm new to the neighborhood, so I have no idea how it works. So I have to figure out if I have to have a lot of candy or just a little bit, because I don't know if it's like a city sponsored thing or if kids just go around or what it is. I'm excited to see what happens, but I get all into it.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah,
I
in
don't know if this is
Denmark.
a big thing in Denmark, but houses here have I feel like this is trend now, all about Halloween. So there's big spiders and cobwebs and inflatable pumpkins. Like, when did this start?
Yeah, here it still varies where you are. Like in the suburb where my sister lives, they go all in and they buy all sorts of stuff, and some people really get into it. In the city, not so much.
Okay, got it. Good,
So,
fun.
but that's going to be exciting. But I'm really excited to finally talk to you on this one, Sree. We've talked about it for so long, so it's really cool to finally be doing it.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think it's been a while since we've caught up. I'd love to just kind of hear what's going on and see where our thoughts are with what's happening out there in the world and in this space. So that's
Yeah,
what I do.
absolutely. No, that's super good. Maybe with that, Sree, a big welcome to Next Frontier.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been really watching this podcast. I've enjoyed it. So I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. And there's a lot I want to talk to because super quick recap for the listener, and you'll be able to go through it a little bit as well. But I think your journey is quite fascinating, right? So starting all the way from being a human rights lawyer to then leading sustainability at Kearney, lots of stuff happening in between, of course. And the international side of things just opens up for a lot of good discussion topics, right? So you mentioned a little bit what's going on right now. Like, I'm not going to be able to hold back from talking a little bit about the US and
I was going to
um,
ask.
exactly. But it's so different, right? Like we're based in Europe, so we're doing a lot of compliance work these days, and that is a very different world in the US, at least on supply chain sustainability, than it is in Europe, right?
Right, right.
And I guess you've been working with tons of Fortune 500 companies,
Mhm.
so I'm really looking forward to pick your brain on how does that look like? How is it influenced by Europe? What's your thoughts on the two directions we can take in the upcoming elections? Because they look quite different, but does it matter? And all of these things. So I really want to deep dive with you on that. But I
Oh,
also want to deep dive with you on the kind of the developing economies aspects, right? Because you've had boots on the ground in countries like Rwanda, working with traceability in the coffee sector, all of those things. And then that leads to topics like traceability, living wages, and so on. So I really want to see if we can get into that as
yeah.
well.
Well, let's start with the topic of the hour, which is literally a couple of days away for us, which is the elections. And it's really appropriate that you bring it up because just this past week, the conversations I've had with clients or people at the firm has really been around that. Well, how how does the market, how are people perceiving sustainability? If we look at our recent debates, there was allusions to climate change or people alluding to climate change.
Hmm.
And what we're trying to do with that in the US. So I think on some level it is a topic, but in
Hmm.
certain ways, nothing's really going to change in
Yeah.
terms of what the efforts we're making and the influence the EU regulations are having for companies. That's still top of mind. So yeah, US elections, let's see what happens. I definitely think it's a debatable topic in terms of how much capital, how much influence the regulations are going to have
Hmm.
on companies.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing we're facing right now is really the EU regulations. Like CSDDD is coming out.
Hmm.
It's only a couple of years away for US companies to have to look at that. So
Hmm.
that's where I'm pivoting a lot of my conversations because regardless of what's happening with the politics here, we're still a global economy and we're being influenced by global issues and global regulations.
Yeah, 100%. I wanted to hear your perspective on that because we're seeing it, right? Like we're talking with big US companies like Starbucks, and they're talking about European regulation because they have operations there. So is that kind of one of the driving forces when you guys talk to, US based Fortune 500? Are they really, EU regulations, CSRD, CSDDD, all of those things, or are there other kind of bigger driving forces when they think about sustainability implementation?
So one thing is obviously the regulations, but let's take a step back and think about what we're talking about when we talk about a company. And to
Mm.
me, it really centers around that product, right? That
Mm.
product or that service. And a lot of the companies that I work with are product-based companies, whether it's the big beverage companies, food companies, our clothing that we wear, the cars that we
Mm.
drive. All of that is what we are talking about when we think about sustainability at the end of the day. So the regulations are really having an impact from that perspective of that raw material. So you think about the deforestation regulation, that's going to impact any company that is sourcing from a country that is having issues around these environmental or human rights issues.
Mm.
So I think it really does come back down to, how are we sourcing this stuff? And that's where I've found that there's a lot of issues around the environment and human rights.
Mm.
So when we think about what the companies are facing, I'd like to go back to, well, what are we really talking about sustainability? Yes, it's operations, but what are our operations surrounded by? What are the
Mm.
components that make up that operation? And so regulation is one of them. So we're seeing a lot of regulations when it comes to the raw materials and sourcing, like I said, and the supply chain. But I think a lot of it too is there's consumer driven perspectives now that are coming up. You think about health aspect of it. When you think about our
Mm.
everyday food, for example, why are we talking about traceability? Because there's more recalls when it comes to food. There's more issues around human rights, right? So how does that impact the consumer at the end of the day when we're buying these products? So beyond the regulation, yes, we have to follow that, but there's also beyond compliance. It's really what are we offering to the market? How are the consumers responding? We think about even the global threats that happen in that supply chain. Can we reinvent our supply chain thinking about the security issues that are out there, political issues that are out there? So I think there's a gamut of things that we have to look at when we think about sustainability and even sustainable business models and supply chains in that way.
Hmm. And I 100% agree with that. And I I mean, we're a sustainability venture, right? So I've been pitching to investors 100 times. Why do companies want to take action on sustainability? And the pitch is always broader, right? It's not just compliance. It's, anything from consumers, as you say, to investors, optimizing for it and having like an ESG component when they're allocating investments, premiums being allocated to more sustainable companies. It's employees who care about it and are pushing pressure internally and all of these things. But while I have that story and I have statistics from, McKinsey and BCG about premiums and these kind of things, we've seen such a massive urgency shift due to regulation, right? Like it's gone from being a topic we can discuss and we can be like, yeah, impact, blah, 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 nice to have, to, oh, we need to do something now because we're going to get fined 8% of revenue in 2 years if we don't do it, right? So how does that look like when, obviously you guys are operating a little bit broader when you talk with management and sustainability strategy and so on. How does the kind of motivations and the, nice to haves and interest versus actually investing and taking action look like?
That's a great question. So at Carney, a lot of what we see is really in that upstream supply chain, what's happening in upstream. We're looking at things from the operational perspective. So when I think about the upstream, and this is probably a lot where, you work too, is really what is happening when we think about who we source from. And I think this is where we have to start to think about when we think about scope 3, when we think about human rights. Can we diversify our supplier base? And that's really a large part of what Carney looks at. Now, when we do that, of course, when you think about the business value, you think about obviously the bottom line, the revenue streams that happen, the cost efficiency. So from a business perspective, yes, it's the regulations. And now the regulations are putting more pressure on directors, for example, or things getting stopped at the border here in the U.S. because of the UFLPA, for example, stopping things at the border, automotive airlines, electronics, everything you can think about is getting stopped at the border, right? So the regulations are there. Is it stopping companies from change? Is it, helping companies change some of their operations? We're getting there, not quite yet. So how can we talk about it beyond regulations? And that's when we talk about that business driver and the value. So yes, the regulations are the impetus, but can we drive value from that? So when we think about human rights, what are the financial values as well as the social impact? Can we change our business models in a way that can provide better operations, provide a different kind of revenue stream? So there's different ways to address this using the regulation. And that's what I think we need to start to get to. So yeah, the regulation is there, do your due diligence, but can the regulation be a way that you think about your business models on the ground? Are you bringing in different stakeholders and communities when you think about human rights? Are you putting in better technology when we think about the environmental piece? That's what the regulation is asking for. So all of this to me is building the ecosystem. And that ecosystem is going to create change and value for a business. Because at the end of the day, we're to see change when it comes to business operations. There's a new generation asking for a new way of doing business. So to me, sustainability, the regulations, they're the catalyst to create a new way of doing business and doing business right. And that's the way I look at how we look at scope 3, human rights, ESG in general.
Yeah. And what's kind of the concrete driver here? Is it premiums from the consumer? We can brand ourselves as being more sustainable and then we can charge more and then we get more revenues?
I think that depends on industry too. I think this is such a controversial topic because they always say, well, the consumer wants it, but are we willing to pay more for it? And I haven't seen a lot of studies where I've seen that the consumer is willing to pay more for a premium product that is more sustainable. I think we're getting there with a new generation, but I think there's so many factors that is not allowing that to happen. So to me, it's also innovation, so it's when we think about water scarcity, are there innovative ways that we can create these products? And I know the space is looking at this, but bringing that innovation to the corporates is really where that we need to draw that bridge. So there is innovation that's happened when we think about atmospheric water and bottling that versus groundwater that are taking water away from communities. What does that look like? So there's people that are researching this. Now we have to make sure that the companies look at that as a driver, can look at that as doesn't have to be a premium product, but another way of innovating on your product.
Interesting. And I think, I think one of the things that people also sometimes forget is that we all the time associate sustainability with premiums, but there's so many times the solution lies in efficiency. So, we've seen example again where maybe the lens gets directed there because of compliance or consumer push or investor push or whatever. But then once you're looking at it, you're like, oh, we can actually make our operations 30% more efficient, and we're going to then save, both cost and footprint and these kind of things. So there's suddenly a business case around it as well.
Yes, and I think that right now, I think why there's such a strong reaction around efficiencies, because there does take a certain level of capital to reinvent how you're doing your operations. Whether that's in how we are doing farming methods or manufacturing methods. So there will be an intense capital investment, but that pays off over time. And that's what I think we need to look at is how do we look at that over time, whether that's a 3-year over time. But that operational efficiency comes with these changes that could almost be what you consider like low-hanging fruits. Again, let's go back to our food example. It's the most tangible. Food and clothing to me are the most tangible, also cars. But so when we think about our food that we eat every day, when we think about where we procure from, the soil health, for example, all of that is environmental sustainability. All of that is going to connect to your human rights and your supply chain. Are there certain methods that are low-hanging fruits that we can adopt, that a corporation doesn't have to invest a lot of capital, but can help in defining their own goals, but also slowly start to change their operations? So I think that also leads to better efficiency, better inventory management comes up when you think about like traceability and things like that. So all I think the inputs that we have when it comes to sustainability has a great output for operational efficiency. Like I said, waste management, inventory, tracking your revenue stream, understanding what your consumers want. That's something that, for example, with traceability, there's regulations now that are around traceability. So tracing a product in the US, for example, there's the, FDA regulation where we have to trace a product from its source. So if it's a strawberry and I'm eating a beautiful, wonderful strawberry yogurt, I need to know what happened with that strawberry from the moment, what farm it came from, all the way until it got into my yogurt onto the shelf. Now, how can a company follow the regulations, which they have to do, but also have operational efficiency? So taking this regulation that is requiring tracing your product, we can now use those components, those tools to understand your waste, food waste, for example, inventory, refrigeration even. Sometimes there's all these technologies now that when you're doing the tracing and the chips, it can also tell you temperatures. So, and then to the place that you get on the shelf. You mentioned Starbucks at the beginning of this conversation. I was just at a Starbucks on vacation in this very rural town in Georgia. And I walked in and I was so excited. I saw this coffee bag, and on the back of it, it says, "Do you know where your coffee bean comes from?" And it's an app. It's about traceability. I just took my camera and I was able to now trace or see from which farm, because it's a single source, all the way to the shelf, and what that means to me as a consumer. So that's an example of how we can use these regulations to increase operational efficiency, but also have better brand value, better reputation, better connection to your consumer. So yeah, I think there's different ways we can take that and package it for a company. And that's sort of what we're driving at now when we think about value.
Super interesting. Since you brought traceability up, I really want to go into that topic because that's just a whole can of worms. Very, very difficult. You've been working on it specifically with now you mentioned coffee as an example as well. How does that look like? Like, what's the solutions out there? What's the challenges when you're trying to define traceability of a product?
So, a lot of my focus, as you know, Thomas, is human rights. And I think it's really obviously, how do you quantify the human behavior? How do we actually put numbers to this? I think one of the challenges that we face when we think about any of this, from my perspective, is the human rights piece, the quantification of data for that. The environmental piece, we've already had examples where we can quantify what's happening. When it comes to traceability, that's one aspect of it. That's important to note because when I think about the tangible, the real life, we talked about how I've lived in these countries. I spent a significant amount of time in Kenya and Rwanda. on the ground and in India with the farmers. So getting that data is very challenging. And I think we have to be aware in this wonderful age of AI and technology to ensure when we talk about traceability that it's not just about the data that comes with the numbers and the technology. So technology is one piece of it. And we often have clients come to us and say, what's the traceability technology? Well, there is not one technology. We have an entire huge supply chain. And in that supply chain, there will be different technologies and tools. So IT technology, but auditing tools. There's different NGOs out there that are doing a fantastic work gathering data. So to me, traceability is extremely complex because what are we solving for us, essentially? So when we talk to a client or a company, the question is, when you're thinking about traceability, why? What is it you're solving for? Is it because it's the regulation? Okay, well, there are certain solutions out there to address the regulation. Now, can you maximize, like we just talked about, what we know about traceability to now have operational efficiency, consumer insight? That's other technology that comes in. The hardest part to me is that upstream information. So boots on the ground, how we're collecting that data. It's not always going to be AI and blockchain. And I think that's when we think about traceability, there has to be a little bit more awareness, and maybe, again, building that ecosystem where we're working with the humans along with the technology. But yeah, a lot of different things happening in traceability. I was doing something around coffee. So deforestation is a big issue. One of the biggest issues with coffee, for example, single source versus mixed. From my time in Kenya, I know that coffee is procured at an auction. And it's all getting mixed in a bag. So how do you know where that's coming from? What do you do with the coffee that may not be up to standard? Life cycle assessments can happen when you would think about traceability, but with environment. What about the social life cycles? There's a lot. So with traceability, I think we're at the nascent stages, and I think that we have to be very aware that it's not just technology and that there's different data sources to gain from.
Yeah, I 100% agree, because I think, like in my head, I roughly divide the problem up into two. The actual tracing aspect of finding out where did that bean come from and what steps did it go through.
Right.
And then we can analyze it and we can find out, once we know that, we can do anything from LCAs to, human rights risk assessments and all of those things. But tracing it is just really hard. You mentioned blockchain. That was the big thing, maybe 5 years ago. Now we have a solution for it. But ultimately, you still need somebody to enter in the data, right? Somebody needs to say, I bought this from this person or that farm. And if it's direct sourcing, then that's simple. Or if it's just like 1 or 2 layers, then that's simple. But if it's like a 5 to 10 layer supply chain, which it often is, how do you do it?
Exactly. So this is where I talk about ecosystem partners. So NGOs, there's one that I can call Brex, for example, great NGO. They're on the ground, getting the data from the farmers, building in the technology. So I kind of look at, with traceability, you also have your own supply chain. So that's how I kind of visualize it. So it's the same way. In the ingredient, you're also inputting the data from that on the ground at the farm or at if you're mining, whatever it may be, right? So it starts there. So that's where we have to have our ecosystem partners, the nonprofits that are on the ground, the organizations that can build in the technology that feeds into the other software tech tools that are now being deployed to the big corporations. So this is where, even from our own experts at Kearney, what they also say is, we can't get caught up in the technology place. There's no way to fully trace this. But we have to start with different methods. And those different methods are the audits, it's the boots on the ground. It's, I think, social entrepreneurs. I mean, this is why we've built up this space of impact investing and social entrepreneurship. There's an ecosystem of startups that can also digitize and work on the ground upstream in certain areas where we are procuring goods. And again, build that into the larger ecosystem.
Interesting. So in the coffee supply chain specifically, do you know how Starbucks is able to, say this is the specific farm it's being sourced from? Is it because they're buying direct? Or what was kind of the solutions that you were involved with back then?
So I was not working directly with Starbucks, just to
No.
make it clear, right? But have been working with another coffee company, or other coffee companies. So one piece is the single source. When you know where it's coming, single source means I'm just procuring coffee beans from this farm or from this region. So having an understanding of your sourcing was the key, is the key. And a lot of companies, especially that have been around for a very long time, may not know from their where they're sourcing from. And they might know their broker, but that broker may not know where that only that broker would know where that source is. So having visibility into where you source is that first thing. So in this case, single source helps. RFID chips, so when it goes from one farm to another farm, put into the bags, that makes a difference. So I think some of these solutions is where we're seeing it's going to be a little bit easier to trace.
Yeah.
And then also in certain cases, if the coffee company owns the farm, it's a lot easier. And we see that with
course.
cocoa, for example.
Yeah.
So a lot of cocoa companies actually own or lease the farms. And so they're able to trace it. But when you don't have that, then the option is really understanding where you're procuring from, and then these RFID.
And is that by going through intermediaries then? So you go to your direct suppliers, you give them requirements to find out more from their suppliers and so on?
So this is a great way to talk about what we have worked on together, Thomas, because one way, and this is what I've been working on and what I think is just so exciting, is because of these technologies, a procurement person can now scan their suppliers based off of, what we're seeing with a lot of companies, especially with the regulations, is, where are we procuring sugar from? Where are we procuring cocoa from? In the past, you could just get it from whatever region. Now you have to actually look at the actual supplier because of the risk that's happening. So with the technologies that are being developed, we can actually scan from your tier one supplier down to see where that risk is and what needs to happen. So, or who is your supplier when it comes to sugar or that coffee bean way upstream. So when we do that scan, then we can identify whether or not they have the right kind of policies, regulations, and ways of working that are going to mitigate some of the issues around the environment and human rights.
100%.
Yeah.
No, I think it's super interesting. We're still working on the whole technical aspect, so that's why I'm diving a little bit into it, right? Because ultimately, it's about either you can ask suppliers to ask their suppliers and so on. You can look at trading data to find out when was import-export logged. There's some good industry initiatives where sometimes someone else has facilitated the very hard data collection and then you can reuse that. But somebody needs to enter it into a database somewhere in the chain, right? And that's ultimately the trick.
Yeah, the bill of ladles, all of that, right? All of that. But somebody's entering the data. And I think it's important to say the starting point of entering that data. It's so important to first start at the source. And that's where I think we need to have certain kind of technologies that merge with the other technologies, like the one that you have, to help feed that data in.
Like RFID tags, for example.
RFID tags, human beings collecting the data on the ground with the farmers, with the miners, or whomever it may be, entering that data as well. And then the different associations come. Let's talk about coffee. Where's the coffee association in a region about this too, right? So there are coffee associations now. We're seeing different type of trade organizations that are also helping to collect that data that feed it in. So I think you're right to say, like, okay, we can't just be limited. It's no longer just about identifying it from an audit or from certain kind of, paperwork that you're doing for trading or whatever it may be. It has to be from another perspective. And to me, that's kind of where it comes from.
Super interesting. So if we zoom up a little bit again, and we talk, we kind of round the regulatory environment off. So when you kind of talk to Fortune 500, is it very biased by EU legislations? Do you see kind of something that's going to happen on the US front? Like, how are you viewing that space?
The US is also very regulatory heavy. We're probably one of the biggest litigious countries in the world. So I definitely think that regulations are a very important driver. the EU regulations in certain industries, US regulations in certain industries is how I would say it. So let's take like the fashion industry that I work in. There's now heavier regulations around the fashion industry about procuring cotton, for example. So we have the Worker Forced Labor Protection Act. That is really, really heavy here for that industry, more so than any EU regulation. Same thing with the automotive industry. So we might actually find that CSDDD is going to be more of a pressure point for companies. So to me, I think it's very much industry
Yeah.
and what kind of product you're offering.
Yeah.
So for food, we talked about the Food Act. So that's the traceability where we have to trace the food. So less EU, more US in that sense.
But I think is my interpretation correct that the EU has issued some very broad legislations like the CSRD and CSDDD that applies to almost all companies and also tackles like a very broad spectrum of social and environmental topics, whereas the US legislations, it's a lot more focused, right? It's focused on like the Modern Slavery Act, for example, or it's focused on the food industry or the apparel industry or something like that. Do you think that it's going to get broader in the future, or do you think it's going to stay a little bit in the foreseeable future like it is today?
So this goes back to the politics. So
Yes.
we pay a lot of money for lobbying here in America.
Yeah.
So I'm a former lawyer, so I kind of think of things from that place of like the law and how law is created, and we think about regulations and the policy and the lobbying behind it. So there's been a lot of lobbying behind some of these regulations you're talking about. So we think about the Fashion Act that's happening, or you think about circularity, or even what the governor's doing in California. We are very much state-oriented that way, industry-oriented that way. I don't know if we've had a lot of push from the federal government in terms of regulations the way that the EU has. So that's the differentiation. I think if there's the broader regulations coming from the federal government, we're going to see more defined regulations coming out. But there's such a pushback right now, and especially the past couple of months where, we've seen investors pull back. We've seen the climate around DEI pull back. So I think a lot of what's going to happen is still going to stay in these sort of industry or state focused around circularity, around packaging, around textiles, around food. But until we get bigger buy-in and push from the federal side, I think we're not going to see the same kind of reaction that we're seeing in the EU.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned a DE&I pushback. What's happening there?
So with DEI, oh, well, gosh, I think it's pre-Trump, but there's definitely some, controversy there. But in the last couple of months, there has been companies, or I guess the greater social environment has been questioning the efforts made around DEI initiatives within companies. And really, has there been, why, and is it actually more skewed? So we're seeing companies and CEOs like Elon Musk pull back and say that DEI is not really that important. And but we're also seeing, you have other stakeholders that say, look, it is important. It's really just about defining the initiatives and measuring the initiatives. But we definitely have a backlash. And then, just because we have to talk about politics with elections a couple of days away, there was the controversy of Trump and Kamala Harris having a discussion, and that there was something that was alluded to, the fact that Kamala Harris is only in her position due to DEI in the world of politics and America. So because of that, there's all this controversy now, and companies are pulling back a little bit. Universities are talking about it, but it's a metric that is so important when we think about ESG.
Yeah.
But it's taking a bit of a change now in terms of how companies are trying to measure it and really implement it.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you think, like on the supply chain side, that you'll see companies pull back some of the minority ownership programs that they've pushed out?
I think in terms from supplier perspective, I don't get a sense that there will be any pullback from a supplier perspective. So when I think about DEI, there's DEI from supply chain, who's supplying the products. we actually see a lot more companies joining the billion-dollar roundtable, making women's initiatives, and that goes back to what we talked about earlier, the sustainability. And I don't mean like environmental sustainability. I mean the sustainability of your company, the resilience of your company is through the diversification of the portfolio of those who supply to you. So that will be there, I think, and I think that's still increasing. In terms of the initiatives, it's really going to be, to me, it's a company. There's nothing that's monitoring it necessarily. So it's really going to be more about what's the ethos of the company and how do we drive the initiatives for impact. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of a pullback in terms of investment made into DEI models.
Yeah, interesting. What about from a climate perspective? I remember, I think Biden, he launched something around decarbonization of public procurement and stuff like that. I could imagine that anything related to that would be a pullback if we switch to Trump right now.
So I think last year, Biden did announce the Climate Fellows program. So it's where we are trying to engage more people into the climate employment and learning and kind of building up climate initiatives and technologies and really building up that workforce. I'm also curious to see what happens with that initiative. In certain ways, there will be a pullback, I think. But in a lot of ways, there's so much that's already in place in terms of what's changing. So you think about the automobile industry. There's already changes that are being made in the US in terms of going more green, going more electric. So jobs will have to be increased. And so that is something that if Trump comes in, he will have to see, like, you can't disassociate new jobs and new education around green technologies. So, and then one of his things is about employment and raising, the employment of the country. So I think this is more of an opportunity for him.
True.
And so hopefully he will look at it from that perspective. But, we'll have to see how the bigger regulations change. Like I said, look, I don't think it's going anywhere. It really, like, we've already started. We're in this now. It's just a matter of the level of commitment the company or other stakeholders will make based off of the politics.
Very interesting. A little bit of a sidetrack, but I have a pet theory. You mentioned Elon Musk earlier, who's just that guy, and the journey he's gone through to become so kind of Trump focused that it staggers me. But I have a pet theory that he's doing it to get influence over his EV policies, because he was so hostile towards EVs before. Now he's starting to be a little bit, these are actually quite cool and stuff like that. It might not be true and the guy is just crazy, but it would be very smart, like if you're hedging your bets, right, and you go one way in the election and it's going to be all double down on EVs, and the other way and it looks terrible, right? If you're hedging your bets, why don't you make yourself an ally and start influencing the bad direction?
That is smart. I didn't even think about that. I think you're right. I think that's what it is probably trying to get ahead of what could happen and how that could affect his own company and his own life. So I didn't even think about that, but I 100% think that's part of it.
That's my hope, at least. Yeah. And it's not the megalomaniac thing that it looks like from the outside.
I think one of the unfortunate parts of when we think about things here in the US is also elections is around taxes and tax bracket. And so I don't put that aside either with him, that there is also that whole agenda of protecting ourselves at a certain tax bracket.
No, absolutely. But the guy is weird, right? Like he's he sold all of his houses, right, and started living out of a whatever container or something like that to not be materialistic and so on. But I bet you there's a ton of tax scheming going on in the background as well.
I definitely think so. I think it's so fascinating to me that someone can have that kind of an influence in politics. I mean, thank you for the cars, but really, do you have to influence like the rest of the world with your talk right now? So I don't know. He's definitely. I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this relationship. I think Trump has some fun allies around him.
Yeah.
some
Well,
character, I would say.
at least the as a last word on the topic, it's highly entertaining. In Denmark, we follow it a lot. It's when he was in office last time, we got entertained almost every day. It's all over the news, and then it stopped after that. So at least we'll get the entertainment back.
Well, you don't have to live here. I wish Denmark had the golden visa. I could
Yeah,
come onto your side and be entertained.
100%.
It is really fascinating to see what's happening coming this close to the elections and the type of influence that celebrities have still on all of this. When we talk about Elon Musk, I think it just goes to show our culture right now, which is very much being influenced by that public persona. It's not so much about I don't even know what Trump's policies are. No one knows what Trump's policies are, but he's head to head with Kamala. So for us, I talk about this with my friends. We are very much this culture, and I've lived all over the world. So for me, sometimes I come back and I look at it as an outsider. I'm like always like, oh, I lived in a village in India, so I'm an outsider. I have no idea. At the end of the day, I am an American, but it comes back when I look at our culture here. We're very much that pop culture right now. That very much like we're so influenced by the media, and I don't know how it is everywhere else with politics, but there is this reality TV kind of generation influence that's happening here, and Trump knows how to play that. He is so
Yeah.
good with influencing the public in that way. He's just has a knack for it. So I think it's kind of scary because again, I don't know what the policies are. It's great entertainment, great ratings, but yet to see how that influences our economy and our day to day.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I could keep discussing this forever, but if we zoom back out and we look at kind of the global context again. So we talked a little bit about traceability before.
Right.
You identify issues, let's say human rights issues in your supply chain. One of the things we've talked about before that I would love to kind of get your opinion on again is that a lot of these issues and risk and violations are ultimately related to poverty. So, the knee-jerk reaction of just removing the risk by eliminating operations in high-risk countries just makes the problem worse, right? So how are you talking with corporates about, once you've mapped it out, once you've identified problems, how do you fix it? Because I guess it's too bad if the result is just we eliminate it and we pull back because the poverty will still be there and then other consequences will happen.
Absolutely. Now that's a great point and something that I think about all the time because I've lived in the countries and I understand. There's always this controversy of in certain countries, children are taken to work on the field with the families because there's no other option, and that is just the culture. And so there's always this fine line of how do you ensure that the cultural sort of identity is still intact, but we're also being aware that the unfairness and the injustice. And what I have found and what I truly believe is that it's all about how you work with that business model. And it's not the same in every country. So I think when we think about like mining in the DRC, we can't really change a business model in the mining industry. There's certain, and you can only get those raw materials from certain countries. So for every industry or every raw material or every whatever we're thinking about, there's going to be different actions that can be taken. Some will be, let's get out of the country. Some will be, let's just pull together an association and change it. When it comes to poverty, what I have seen living in India and living in sub-Saharan Africa is change the business models. At the end of the day, every single person on this planet wants to eat, they need to be fed, clothed, and have water. So what is driving an individual who is, and I go back to the corporate, so we are getting our products from other countries or raw materials, most likely, in the US. So we're getting it, our raw materials from parts of Africa, from parts of India. What is happening on the ground? They are living in poverty. It's not just about the wages. It's how do you change the business model? If we're talking about our clothing, are there women shareholders? Are they creating the designs themselves along with you as a designer? Are we creating platforms using technology where we're taking out the middleman who is paying less than what need to be paid for these products and upcharging it to the corporates? Right? So I think there's certain ways at the end of the day we can't eliminate all poverty. We're talking about poverty within the supply chain, and it's about providing an income. And that income can only come in a fair way when we think about creating better business models, eliminating the inhibitors like third-party distributors that are still capitalizing off of hard labor. So I think when we start, and you know, I grew up in this field at a time of microfinance. Are we providing avenues for micro entrepreneurs who are part of our supply chain to really be part of the ecosystem, not just a laborer, but really have an investment on a certain level within what we're creating?
That's fascinating, and it reminds me a lot of, like, it's very interesting being in this space, because I unfortunately or fortunately have to sit down and read all of these legislations end to end, so I see how they evolve over time as well, and you know, different country legislations and so on. And what I found fascinating about the CSDDD was two things. One, it mentions that you really need to look into to what extent you are causing these problems. So again, in the apparel industry or similar, if we're putting so much price pressure on our suppliers that there's no way they can deliver on it without sacrificing a living wage or without suddenly have forced or child labor or so on, then that's actually your responsibility and you're going to be penalized as such, right? It's not the supplier's responsibility. You're not giving them the opportunity to, you know, do well in that context, right? And on a similar angle, it also says, hey, if you find a violation, then, you know, before you just remove it, examine the consequences of doing so, right? Are you actually going to make the problem worse? Because if you are going to make the problem worse by pulling back labor from that, you know, farm or region or whatever, then that's not the best outcome. And then it's actually maybe better to try to continue to mitigate and work and collaborate, you know, on that specific violation versus just, you know, covering yourself and getting away from it.
So it's such a complex scenario, but this is the way I see it, because the companies at the end of the day, they're not here. Their mandate is not to solve poverty or the world's problems. Their mandate is to give us a product or service that we can consume, right, at the end of the day. However, they have a responsibility, and that responsibility includes being innovative and thinking about different ways that you can create a better supply chain. So I want to give you a couple of examples how we can think about that and of companies that have done this successfully and how I tie that into CSDDD. So many, many years ago, in, like, I would say the 2009-10 era of my work, IKEA has a great example of having good human rights visibility and how they've literally looked at the environment. And I worked on a project with an entrepreneur out of India where they work with artisans who make, you know, table runners or your pillows or whatever IKEA sells. And so she's a supplier, so she became a supplier. But what she ended up doing was working with IKEA and these artisans that actually would have been paid as an employee, rural part of India, definitely parts of poverty, women, mostly women, and created a platform where they are the ones who sell the design to IKEA. Now, the supplier is somewhat of a designer, so they oversee it. They make sure that the women are in the right areas, they're getting the right skills. So that's where a supplier can come in, is providing the right skills. And you can get grant money for that too, if you're set up the right way, like this entrepreneur is. And the artisans were able to work directly with IKEA. They created their own cooperative, they became shareholders, they have their own tech platform. So now the IKEA designers can work directly with the artisans, give the inputs, and the standard is still there, and the output is at scale. Now, typically what happens is a company like an IKEA would just employ the artisans or the women, or employ the supplier and pay a certain amount. Well, like we said, that supplier is not going to have the money to build the skills a certain way. And so what you do is you end up continuing to just pay these laborers who just come in for the day and they leave, and they're not building that ecosystem. You're not building their skills for them. You're almost even keeping them in poverty, and you're not providing them an opportunity to elevate, to have ownership. Every human being wants to feel like they have ownership of something, right? To give validation. So they are now they have ownership of this. So they're mentally they're in a great spot. Financially now they're getting paid what they have created to be fair, and they work in a community. The same thing when we think about farming, like Ocean Spray is to me one of the best models because they are a collective of cooperatives. So the co-ops, the farmers are the ones that are doing the new technologies, that are doing the drip irrigation, but the capital is coming from Ocean Spray. And guess what? Ocean Spray is a $1 billion company. Their revenues are like huge, right? So they're eliminating poverty, they're providing skills, but yet they have business value. Same thing with IKEA. So this to me is, when you think about the business models on the ground, that's what I talk about. Are there ways that you can bring in the ones that are upstream, doing the raw materials, that are part of your supply chain, have them become part of the corporation in some way? That's how we eliminate poverty. That's how we build better skills, and that's how we build that ecosystem. And you're driving down cost from a company perspective because you're eliminating a lot of people in between. You have more control, and you're driving more value because you don't have to increase your price. When you're working with cooperatives or when you're working in this kind of way, you don't even have to increase your price to have premiums. So, yeah, I don't know
I
if that,
like that.
yeah.
I think that's fascinating. It reminds me a little bit of an example that I use way too often, but there's a lot of bad mouthing going around buying carbon offsets and these kind of things. But one example that I really love is in the agricultural industry, where companies like Agrina, for example, which is a Danish company, they've turned it around to say, hey, we will help a farm transition to regenerative agriculture, and then that's going to generate offsets, and then that's what you buy. But because there's so much asset investments in transforming the farm to run on kind of regenerative agriculture, the farm needs investments, right? So the whole financing thing happens through the offsets, right? You're buying the offsets because you want to offset your emissions right now. Buying that finances a farm to transition into regenerative agriculture, which has a long-term business case, but it's a very difficult thing for a farmer to do without any financing. And then suddenly you have change happening because you've created this financing model that supports it. And I think that those kind of initiatives just makes a ton of sense.
Exactly. And that's when I talk about innovation, right? We're in a time now where, because of all these regulations, because of all these pressures, we have to think innovatively to solve some of the biggest problems. When we think about farming, when we think about in the 80s, my grandfather was from in the village of India. He was a farmer. He held the farms. He had farmers working with him. And I remember going back to the village, and this one time I was there, I was young, I was born and raised in the US, but I went back to the village, and I was exposed to hearing about farmer suicides. All these farmers were committing suicide. And I couldn't understand why. And it was because at that time, what was happening is companies were coming in and bringing in pesticides. And so the yields were not there, because now we went from traditional farming techniques, which we're calling regenerative right now, the traditional farming techniques that didn't have the chemicals. Now, because of how the corporates are working, we need to have the chemicals to provide a bigger food source for a bigger growing economy, blah, blah, blah. All of that happens. But what happens to the farmer? He doesn't have the yields, and he cannot pay for it. And the government's not giving the subsidies to buy these new fertilizers, to buy these pesticides. That is something we have to make sure does not happen in this new adjustment of regenerative agriculture, or what we're calling just transition with anything that we're doing. That financing piece is so key, not just in agriculture, but in every aspect, in every industry. Because it is not fair to pass down that cost or that pressure. So just going back to your point, whether it's carbon credits or building more innovative financing models, that is a very important piece. And the corporates can play a big piece in that too. There's different ways that corporations can also hit their ESG goals by coming with better financing for suppliers or farmers and things like that. So, yeah.
One challenge that I'm thinking of as we are talking about this, right? Because I have read a lot of sustainability reports of, massive companies, Nestle, Unilever, And it will always have these concrete stories, right? About this one thing they did on this farm in Kenya, and that kind of massively changed things, and that was great. And it's good for storytelling. But isn't it a little bit of a drop in the ocean? They have 60,000 suppliers, 100,000 suppliers. Like, at best, they can create these change programs for, I don't know, 100, 200, 500, 1,000. But still, it must be very difficult to do this at scale across a full supply chain.
Difficulty because I think it takes the commitment of the leadership and the buy-in from the leadership and the capital. So you're right, good efforts drop. And I think what Unilever and some of the other ones have done was at a certain time where this was so important, but now everybody needs to start doing it, which means that they have to increase their efforts more, for example. So I think it's taking the success story that happens in one area and being able to now replicate it across. And I've come across this with our clients too. When we have worked on something, we've been able to do it in one aspect of their project or one region, something with the leadership stops them, or they're unable to now replicate that across. So I echo your sentiment and I completely hear you. And I think now it's really about taking that push. And to me, it really falls with the leadership because now there's something that's proven. And I do think that, I want to be idealistic, but at the end of the day, it really does come down to the numbers. And we see this quite often. A lot of our clients come to us because they are under a lot of pressure now in terms of their bottom line. We've got inflation. We have so much pressure in terms of global procurement that is happening. And we don't want to pass that. They don't want to pass that down to the consumer. So I think that's another aspect of it that is a challenge that a lot of corporates who have the best of intentions are trying to balance. So the intention might be there, but how do you now balance that with the bottom line and the capital investment that it requires to continue?
100%. And do you think that's what stopped the programs from spreading? That was kind of the further investments required, but limited ROI maybe, or what was kind of the experience there, you think?
I think everything with sustainability is balancing that ROI between impact and finance, right? And I think we have to start to push ourselves to think about right now, let's focus on the impact and let the financial take a little bit of a backseat until everything balances back out, and then we go back to the financial impact. But I would say that a large part of it, and again, especially right now in the world climate that we're in when it comes to some of the economics and the pressures around the economics, is we're seeing more of a cutback or more of an evaluation of, we're putting a lot of investment into some of these projects, whether it's like certifications or building certain models. We know there is a social impact ROI. How do we know that's going to have an impact financially now because of all these other pressures? So I definitely think that companies are having to balance that and make choices on where they're investing when it comes to sustainability or impact, and where they have to pull back or cut their initiatives. So that balance is something that I think can be challenging. But again, that's where that data comes in, and we really have to think about what is material for that company moving forward.
Yeah. And are there any kind of more obvious areas where you see that, okay, here it's quite easy to create a business case around it versus others?
Again, I think I go back to industry, and I think about, when I think about food, when I think about, what kind of products you're procuring from where, I think it's easier to make a business case when we think about what is the core of our product and where we're procuring from. But I still think it's extremely challenging to at this exact stage to onboard leadership to know where to cut back and where to invest, and to put sustainability as that priority.
Yeah, 100%. Fascinating. Very, very interesting, Sree. We are about to run out of time, so I also want to ask you if you have any last words you want to leave the listeners with. If they want to get started, on sustainability, sustainable supply chain, what's the best advice? How do they get started?
So for the consumer, for our everyday people, I think if we have an interest in living in a sustainable world, it's up to us to drive the market. And so to ask for it, because I think it's a very challenging time for corporations to provide us with products that are more sustainable, just because of the capital. But if we ask for it, then I think it helps drive them to be more innovative and to build what needs to be built. When it comes to supply chain, when we think about the corporations, it's a time now where we can take those regulations and think of it as an opportunity. So, so again, as a lawyer, I'm all about the regulations, follow the rule of law. We love that. But from a business perspective, taking those regulations is really just a way of doing business differently and better value for your bottom line and better value for the community that you serve and better value for your consumers. So I think, to me, the last parting words are, the regulations are there, but there's ways that we can take those regulations and what it's asking of us and the tools and technologies that are being developed and drive value across the board. And that's what we need to start to focus on.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Sree, this was a huge pleasure. I know I'll listen to this again in 1 or 2 years to compare it with what we said about the elections and all of these things and what actually happened. But thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier. Huge pleasure.
It's so great to speak with you again. I really appreciated the conversation and helped me start to think more about what we're doing here and holding my breath for next week to see what happens in the election. So we'll have to see what happens.
Absolutely. I'll reach out for commentary after the final results.
Sounds great. So good to connect with you again. And thank you again, Thomas.
Likewise. Have a great day
too.
If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Sotu, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.